first met at a scans event about 8 or 9 years ago, and have been very interested in the amazing work that she's been doing then, and particularly around rivers and water ecosystems. So tonight, Leah will do some sharing of her work with us. And just before we hand over to Leah, I just would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the unceded land of the Ngunnawal people and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And on that note, thank you, Leah, for joining us. I'm really looking forward to your talk, and I am now going to turn my camera off.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that introduction, Tracy, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this event. I mean, it's been nice to be part of some of the earlier conversations, and I wish I could have participated more, because it looks like such a incredible group of participants and presenters as well. And it sounds like you've all been having an amazing time. So I guess when we're talking about locative media and the kind of meeting of the waters, or water in general, and the potential of creativity in climate action, these are really all of my favorite things. So I quite enjoyed putting together the material for tonight, and yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing some of my work with you. So I might need to screen share. There we go. I think it's the next tab. That's it. So I'm going to talk quite broadly about, I guess, sound and the potential of acoustic ecology and locative media in aquatic ecosystems, and kind of weave that with a whole series of creative projects. So I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm coming to you from today. I'm on Gubbi Gubbi country on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I wanted to use this image as part of an acknowledgement of country, because this is a fairly significant part of Gubbi Gubbi country on the Maroochy River, quite close to the mouth of the Maroochy River, with an image of a drone shot from a project last year called Listening in the Wild, which was a collaboration with Lyndon Davis, which I'm going to speak about towards the end of this presentation. And I'd also like to acknowledge Lyndon's work, and I will be speaking about some of the collaborations with Lyndon several times throughout this presentation as well. So most of my work is really revolving around looking at the potential of creative responses with new technologies and interdisciplinary thinking in response to climate change, acknowledging that we're in a pretty catastrophic situation and we rapidly need better ways to address the challenges that are happening in different parts of the world. And I'm really passionate about how sound can really be a response to biodiversity loss, acknowledging that, 50% of all land-based species are at risk of being lost in this century, and that's not dramatically different for aquatic species either. So all of the work that I'm engaged in, whether that be purely creative practice or the more locative media-based work that I'm doing, is primarily all revolving around sound. Even the interdisciplinary projects where I'm engaging quite strongly with visuals as well always have a very strong focus on sound. So I'm passionate about what we can learn from listening to the environment and the way that environmental field recordings and live streams can really reveal information about the patterns and changes that are happening in different parts of our planet, and how listening at a deeper and more embodied level to these ecosystems in place can really allow us to connect to these environments and in turn, want to protect them. So as part of, my creative practice and my engagement with science, I'm really interested in facilitating that process of listening in communities. So I'm really passionate about, engaging directly with communities in place and facilitating these different listening experiences. And for me, a lot of this work is really about bringing these ecosystems to urban environments. I can see Ros Bant is here with us, and I can actually see Ros. So you probably can't see where my arrow is, but see Ros in this concert hall here, which was an immersive concert a few years ago, looking at bringing the soundscapes of, in this particular instance, aquatic ecosystems to listeners that may have not had the opportunity to listen underwater to these environments. So an immersive performance of a work called Migration Patterns here. And I'm also really interested in long durational installation-based pieces. So surround sound works, which are drawing on live streams and location field recordings to really immerse people in environments that they may not traditionally have access to. And that extends to a lot of site-specific work. I'm going to talk about this project in particular called Listening Underwater towards the end of this presentation as well, but looking at ways that we can create these site-specific performance venues and make these soundscapes, particularly of aquatic environments, much more accessible to local communities. And locative media, augmented reality sound walks, and the idea of sort of using location-based experiences to connect communities to the environment in new ways has been really core to my practice as an artist for well over a decade now. The River Listening Project, which Tracy mentioned earlier, has been a big focus of what I've been doing for the last, almost 7 years now, and looking at how we can use mobile technologies to really draw communities to understand and connect with the sounds beneath the surface of river systems. So this is an example of the River Listening sound walks, where the sounds of the river system are planted along the riverbanks, and communities can listen to those sounds as they walk along the riverbank. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of how that practice has evolved throughout this presentation. But as an example of how some of this work has been presented, we developed a large-scale installation called Rainforest Listening, which was, very much connected and an extension of River Listening, where the soundscapes of the central Amazon rainforest that I was privileged to record almost exactly a decade ago, and these were mapped through Times Square in New York to create this complete juxtaposition of the multi-sensory overwhelm of Times Square with these rich and dynamic and embodied soundscapes of the central Amazon. And this was created specifically for a conservation NGO called Rainforest Partnership as part of their community engagement activities for Climate Week in New York City, with the idea that, they're part of these conversations to bring a wider awareness and activism to what's happening in the central Amazon rainforest, but without the opportunity to actually take people to these ecosystems and immerse them in the changing soundscapes. They were quite challenged with how they could, encourage decision makers and people who were engaged in these decision-making processes. How could they really encourage them to fall in love with the Amazon and want them to protect it? So this was part of a much broader research project, really looking at the potential of location-based audio experiences, locative media, in connecting people to ecosystems, and in how we can really explore that juxtaposition of bringing a remote tropical rainforest or a remote ecosystem to an urban environment and mapping it through these locations and have communities engaging with it that way. And we took this particular kind of concept one step further for COP21 in Paris, where, looking at, instead of mapping the Central Amazon Biosphere Reserve over Times Square in New York City, it was mapped in a horizontal plane, looking at the distinctive soundscapes of each of the 4 layers of tropical rainforest vegetation and mapping those to each platform of the Eiffel Tower. And this was again done in partnership with Rainforest Partnership as a way to bring attention and awareness to the activism work that they were doing in these communities. And I will talk a little bit more about specifically how that Rainforest Listening Project and River Listening Project, in terms of their approach to locative media and location-based audio experiences, really connect throughout this presentation. So for me, this is all about how we can really look at the potential of new technologies in connecting us to the environment and understanding these patterns and changes in global ecosystems through sound. And it's pretty fascinating when we look at the tools that are being used to monitor ecosystems from across the planet. You know, when we look at an image like this, we've got virtually no idea what's happening in this rainforest, the presence or absence of particular species. But we're now at a point where this field of acoustic ecology and ecoacoustics is becoming a lot more mainstream. Devices are becoming more accessible and affordable. And the idea of monitoring the temporal and spatial complexity of changing environments, monitoring the patterns and changes in ecosystems across the planet in a way that can be managed directly by local communities, where communities have the agency over this data and can actually manage these research processes. This is now realistic. It's completely possible to do this. We've got an incredible diversity of new technologies available now, including the Audio Moth, which has been a completely revolutionary device for ecoacoustics and acoustic ecology more broadly, particularly from a scientific perspective, but also from a community engagement and citizen science perspective as well. So this is no bigger than a credit card. It takes a micro SD card, 3 AA batteries, and that will record in a remote location, including underwater, for up to and well over a month, depending how it's programmed. So this device, which, you know, you can basically put 10 of them in your back pocket and, you know, hike to the center of the Amazon rainforest and install them in a really accessible and affordable way, completely transformational in terms of the accessibility of the field of ecoacoustics and acoustic ecology more broadly. So this kind of work, this intersection of artistic and scientific approaches and looking at the possibility of new technologies, really intersects in a couple of large-scale projects that I've been leading for a number of years, including Biosphere Soundscapes, which is basically mapping the changing soundscapes of UNESCO Biosphere Reserves. So this is a large-scale interdisciplinary project where we've been very privileged to work with a range of biosphere reserves across the planet. And we have kind of structured this project in a way that it essentially has a whole range of different ways. I don't know why it's flipping back slides. What's going on? That's doing it on its own. I'm gonna not touch it. I think it's okay now. Can everyone still see my slides? Hopefully, yes. I'm going to go with yes. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened there. The slides were flipping backwards. That's a yes. Excellent. So this project is structured in a way that we offer residencies for artists and scientists, focus on kind of creative outputs from those residencies, internships, masterclasses, community-based biodiversity monitoring, and this is all being kind of threaded into a global sound map, which is evolving into an interactive database that's kind of mapping these changing soundscapes in biosphere reserves. And while this wasn't initially the intention of the project, really looking at policy and the designation processes of biosphere reserves has become a really important part of this research in the last 2 years, where, you know, from a locative media perspective, we're looking at how we can create these interactive databases of audio recordings in biosphere reserves, but how these locative audio experiences and the intersection with science and creative possibilities communities can really, be a measure for environmental health in biosphere reserves. So we managed to basically have sound as a measure for environmental health included on UN agendas for the first time a couple of years ago as part of the World Forum for UNESCO Biosphere Reserves. And we're in the process of actually embedding sound as a monitoring tool into both the designation process and the long-term monitoring of biosphere reserves. And this is very much about, bringing communities together in the Biosphere Reserve to understand what's happening from a sonic perspective in new ways and working directly with local communities, never going to a Biosphere Reserve without permission, always being invited, and ensuring that the traditional custodians of the Biosphere Reserve are leading the process and as engaged as much as possible. So this is also very much about looking at ways that we can use these new technologies to really push what's possible in terms of putting, really accessible devices in the hands of communities. And this is a map which is kind of showing all the biosphere reserves across the planet. Obviously, it would be physically impossible to work with all of these biosphere reserves, but looking at different pathways, particularly in the last 2 years with a significant drop in travel and COVID lockdowns, looking at different pathways for local communities to participate directly in online experiences, whether that be online workshops and forums, in a similar way to this incredible event we're part of tonight, or whether that be accessible kind of resources and access to technologies that can be distributed in a much more accessible online format as well. And this is kind of fed into shifting large elements of the project away from purely recording the environment to actually live streaming through the Biosphere Open Microphone Network, which has been a big focus for the last 3 years in terms of getting these live streams. So live audio streams from different locations in biosphere reserves across the planet and having these feed into both the creative experiences, but also used for biodiversity monitoring and public engagement as well. And this has really been a big part of some of my engagement in projects like Reveille, which is an event led by Soundcamp in the UK. Some of you may be quite familiar with it. I think some people here have also participated in it. And this is basically a work that is tracking dawn chorus around the planet for 24 hours continuously. So jumping from location to location, microphone to microphone, a live broadcast of 24 hours of dawn around the planet. And from the perspective of Biosphere Soundscapes and river listening, which I'll speak about in a minute, this has very much been about, exploring what a dawn chorus actually is as well. When I say the word dawn chorus, I'm sure many of you think about the sounds of, birds and a terrestrial environment. We hear, a whole diversity of species of birds and insects. But when we talk about a dawn chorus, we don't necessarily think about a dawn chorus of macroinvertebrates beneath the surface of a river system, or a dawn chorus of fish and snapping shrimp on the Great Barrier Reef. So this kind of live engagement with different locations around the planet has also been about really breaking down different understandings of what a dawn chorus actually is and how we can engage with ecosystems that are usually beyond our perception. This is an example of that live streaming platform, some of the open microphones in different parts of the planet. And when we look at all of the advancements that are really happening in this field of bioacoustics globally, terrestrial environments have and terrestrial monitoring have been embracing bioacoustics and acoustic ecology methods for decades now. It's quite common, but we're at a point now where we're seeing rapid developments in research in this field every week. New research is published that is revealing more and more information about the importance of sound in our environment, the value of sound as a measure for environmental health, and the way sound actually functions in different environments. So, as one simple example, there's been multiple species of moths that have been documented to have essentially evolved to develop acoustic camouflage that is on par with military technology. So, basically, this camouflage is in response to microbats, small bats that are hunting these moths, and they're using echolocation, so emitting an ultrasonic ping that allows them to essentially see and catch their prey, being the moth. And moths have evolved to basically, a thicker fur on their wings, which is basically reflecting that ping and acting as an acoustic camouflage. And there's been multiple species of moths documented to do this. So quite fascinating that evolution is sort of happening at this sonic level. Likewise, Monica Gagliano, who I know some of you are quite familiar with her work, incredible evolutionary ecologist and scientist who's very engaged with creative practice as well, but has pioneered the field of plant bioacoustics and essentially proved that plants are using sound to communicate, are using sound to survive, and are using sound in quite profound ways as well. That has, really been pushed back on by sciences for many years, but she's managed to prove through multiple studies just how valuable sound is in the plant world. Likewise, we have multiple species of spiders where we're able to document how they're using sound to attract and catch prey, how they're able to use sonic vibrations through webs, and again, how important sound is with particular species that, may be making sound that's beyond our perception, whether that's in an infrasonic or an ultrasonic range above or below our perception. But new research literally coming out every week that continues to emphasize how important sound is in our ecosystems. And when we talk about underwater environments, I'm sure you're all very familiar with the sounds of the humpback whales, which has been an ongoing fascination of mine. I'm sure you're quite familiar with sounds of dolphins as well, for example. And it's interesting when we think about, this narrative of the ocean, of marine environments. We often think about, and we're often kind of fed this narrative of the sea as a silent and peaceful and relaxing environment. But I mean, that truly couldn't be further from the truth. The ocean is an acoustic environment that's full of sound where, marine life are literally reliant on sound to communicate and survive. And when we look at, moving from marine environments to freshwater environments, likewise, whether we're talking about ponds or rivers or estuaries and wetlands, these are dynamic acoustic environments that are full of sound. It's quite interesting, when we look at the surface of a lake or a river, that example that I used before of the trees in the rainforest, we look at the surface of water and we've got no idea what's happening beneath the surface. So these, fairly dramatic changes to aquatic ecosystems are often going unnoticed simply due to visibility. So the impacts of climate change are really visible in these terrestrial environments. We can see changes in the trees, we can see changes in ecosystems, but these changes in aquatic environments are, much more complex to detect. But when we think about, how we can actually respond to this with sound, we can use hydrophones, underwater microphones in a really accessible and engaging way to detect what's happening beneath the surface and connect beneath the surface in a different way. So hydrophones have been such a major part of my practice for many, many years now. And I will acknowledge Ros Bant again, who I saw in the chat there before, who, was a huge inspiration in my early work with hydrophones as well. Ros has been a pioneer of acoustic ecology and sound art in Australia, but also a pioneer of those intersections of how we can really use hydrophones in creative practice in quite innovative ways. So I've been greatly inspired by Roz's work over the years. And, hydrophones have become such an essential tool in the work that I do as well. And I've been really lucky to work. Oh, my slides are going backwards again instead of forwards. Forwards, good, excellent. Really lucky to work with a whole diversity of river systems, recording these changing soundscapes and understanding what those sounds beneath the surface actually mean to the health of the river system. And I became more and more fascinated by how we could really use sound as a measure for environmental health in river systems. And that really led me into the scientific perspectives of using sound to monitor environmental health. And that was sort of fundamentally what started the river listening project. And again, looking at the potential of hydrophones and the way hydrophones have developed in the last several years, meaning that it has become, very accessible and affordable to engage local communities in the process of monitoring river systems with quite high quality hydrophones that are now quite game changing in terms of their capacity to monitor change over time. A standard hydrophone installation of the past, a marine installation, you would be looking at a large hydrophone that is, essentially rigged up with a fairly sophisticated computer, batteries that needs to be installed by scuba divers, needing, a boat and some experienced engineers to get it into the water. So you're looking at, could be upwards of $100,000 to do a serious hydrophone installation for the purpose of capturing long-term scientific data. But because of the rapid advancement of this technology in the last several years, we can now capture the same quality of acoustic data, that something like this device can capture on, something as small as a Raspberry Pi Zero, and connected to a hydrophone such as this, an Aquarian hydrophone, it's able to capture high quality acoustic data that we can use for both creative engagement and scientific monitoring. And this is obviously resulting in massive databases of audio recording, which is again why I'm really interested, along with many of the collaborators that I'm working with, in the potential of live streaming, both as an engagement tool, listening to these different locations across the planet, but also for long-term scientific monitoring. And this kind of potential of those intersections of art and science and the possibilities of new technology, like the Biosphere Soundscapes project, really underpins river listening, which places such a strong value in engaging directly with Indigenous knowledge systems and traditional custodians of local river systems to really map and listen to the river system from different perspectives. We've been really lucky to work with different river systems across the world in developing different approaches to recording, but then also different ways to locate that audio back in the river system so that communities can access it and listen to it, whether that be the location-based, the augmented reality sound walks or locative media sound walks that I'll chat a little bit more about in a moment, or whether that be some of the large kind of interactive maps, which are allowing you to interact with these locations in a very interactive way, or, more performative and installation-based experiences guiding audiences along river systems. And, again, for me, the River Listening Project has always been about how we can engage communities in this process at a really local level and ensure there's pathways to make sure the research is accessible. And this is the mouth of the Noosa River in Queensland, Australia, which is not far from where I am right now. And this is really the location where the River Listening Project was initiated, where I started doing many of these early experiments with hydrophones. The kind of idea of sort of looking at the interdisciplinary possibilities of hydrophones was as part of Floating Land, the Floating Land Festival in 2009. And I was, really lucky to work quite closely with the local council here, the local government, in allowing me to experiment and install hydrophones. But it was always quite interesting because, particularly at that point in time, there was a huge amount of kind of skepticism around what value listening to an environment had and what value these location-based experiences had. And I kind of quite distinctly remember the environmental manager in the council kind of, almost a little bit dismissively saying, well, show me a peer-reviewed scientific journal article that your fish are talking to each other, and we can use that to understand the health of the environment, and, you can put your hydrophones wherever you like. So we sort of, as a team, almost took that as a challenge, in that I realized that in order to, I guess, advance the kind of work that we were doing and, to really leverage the potential of these location-based audio experiences, that we needed to ensure that we had a strong scientific grounding for this work. So that's why we've invested, quite a significant amount of time in publishing scientific journal articles, to the point now that freshwater ecoacoustics is an established, it's still considered emerging, but field of science. There's been about 12 papers that have been published now by extensions of our research team looking at the potential of freshwater ecoacoustics as a monitoring tool. So papers published on the kind of straight science, specifically in scientific journals, but then papers published on the potential of creative interventions and the possibilities of these locative experiences that are then published in scientific journals as well. This example in the Freshwater Science Journal is really breaking down how our location-based sound walks, our augmented reality sound walks, have contributed towards both the science and the community engagement and the advancement of this field of ecoacoustics. And again, this has been about, working in parallel with how we can develop these technologies in an accessible way to get them directly in the hands of communities, and how we can really build these accessible databases that communities can continue contributing to over time. So this is an example of one of the sound map databases where you can plug in particular species and, GPS locate them, add any kind of data associated with that, and also add image files and scientific information about the particular time and place of that recording as well. But, coming back to this sort of, I guess, fundamental focus on creative practice, for me, as much as a lot of this work has been engaging directly with science and with the intention to advance the science in parallel, as someone with, a background as a composer and sound artist, the sonic outcomes and the way we can engage people in these immersive experiences and engage people in these location-based audio experiences is, the most critical outcome for me. And I guess, when we look at location-based audio experiences, I've been, really looking at ways that a mobile phone or a mobile-based experience can connect communities to local environments. And, I was quite interested at the World Parks Congress in 2014 in Sydney, Australia, where there was so many sessions in the youth kind of climate action stream that were all looking at kind of the future possibilities of augmented reality, but, really looking at mobile-based experiences and mobile phones as a kind of key issue in terms of engaging young people in the environment. So there was a lot of papers and a lot of presentations that were kind of pushing this agenda that if we can, get young people to disengage from their phone and to re-engage with the environment and be immersed in a rainforest or immersed in the ocean, then that's a way to kind of facilitate that environmental reconnection and inspire climate action. But I I really was pushing back on those ideas and continue to push back on those ideas, of course, because I think mobile technologies and these locative experiences can have incredible value in reconnecting communities to the environment. And I know many of the participants in this workshop and many of the organizers in this workshop, are also driving similar research. And there's many people that have quite a similar agenda, and so many incredible projects out there now that have genuinely, leverage the potential of mobile technologies to reconnect communities to an ecosystem. And for me, I really started to engage with this practice through a mobile experience called Sonic Babylon, which was created by the late Bill Duckworth and Nora Farrell, two incredible pioneers of locative audio and internet-based music performance. True pioneers in a technical and creative capacity. And they created an app called Sonic Babylon in 2008. Well, it was created in 2007, which was essentially creating these mobile Wi-Fi gardens of sound across the planet. So rather than using GPS, this is riding local Wi-Fi networks and planting sound gardens, and then allowing that local community to kind of plant, prune, or kind of add to a growing sound garden. So you end up with this web of audio in a local community. And at this point in time, in 2008, I hadn't really engaged too much with the potential of locative media. I mean, I'd certainly been exposed to the possibilities in terms of, museum-based audio tours, but this was the first time where I really had the opportunity to collaborate on a project and look at the potential. And then this kind of approach to creating these invisible gardens of sound and looking at the way that sound can really connect us to a place and time and be attached to these locations became really fundamental to my practice. And so, I was privileged to work on Sonic Babylon at that point in time. I was also really lucky to create a whole bunch of Sonic Map experiences when the Sonic Maps app, the kind of year after that launched, which was developed by a team in the UK. We then developed a mobile kind of sound walking application for Biosphere Soundscapes as part of the sort of launch of that project in 2011. But it was a pretty flawed app. It wasn't riding on Wi-Fi or GPS. It was essentially pre-recorded soundscapes that were encouraging people to walk through particular pathways. So they had the agency to kind of, decide where they wanted to walk and how they would engage, but it wasn't really pushing the potential of that technology. With a range of the international kind of locative audio experiences I was working on with Rainforest Partnership in the initial phase of river listening. That was developed through the Reco platform, which evolved into the Podwalk platform, which was also developed by the Reco team. And then over the last 5 years, I've been really lucky to work with Josh Kopacek, who is the developer of Echoes in the UK. And Josh has been a great collaborator. And so we've built a whole range of experiences within Echoes that have, really looked at building different pathways for communities to create their own location-based audio experiences. And this fed into the development of the Orality app, which launched in 2015, and also kind of fed into the development of recording-based apps where communities can basically record straight into their phone and then plant those sounds along the riverbank. But the river listening experiences and the experiences of kind of listening to aquatic ecosystems, for me, this has been quite transformational in looking at how we can really take these experiences to audiences. So, this is our Minister for Environment, Leanne Enoch, kind of listening to the changing soundscapes of the Great Barrier Reef. I think at this point was listening to what it sounds like when an Adani ship goes past the Great Barrier Reef. So I'm really interested. Oh, something's going on with my slides again. Interested in how this this way of engaging with sound allows us to really take these experiences to decision makers and take these experiences to places where we might not traditionally be able to access these sounds. This is connected to the project I mentioned earlier for COP21 in Paris. I don't know why the slides are flicking around, but this is one of my collaborators, Toby Gifford, listening and engaging with some of the material that we planted along the river in Paris, connected to the river listening experience. The slides are flipping back. Hopefully that stays there. And what was really important about this experience is COP21 was obviously a really significant event in terms of climate action. And this was, a time where there was a lot of voices left out of the conversation. So a really important element of the project for us was to be able to bring, voices of Indigenous communities to the river system to be planted alongside the voices of decision makers as they were evolving during COP. So we updated this sound walk every day. We had live hydrophones streaming in the river as well. And it became this kind of evolving response to what was happening at COP, but weaving the voices of Indigenous elders alongside decision makers in a way that was really, ensuring that those voices could be heard. And the Orality project was really about looking at how we could take those concepts of all of these different sound walks that were developed on specific river systems, sound walks through urban environments, whether that be, the Eiffel Tower or Times Square in New York, and really look at how we can extend this idea of a locative-based audio experience through an entire state. So Orality was launched as an app as part of the Queensland Music Festival, but we basically had sound walks in all of these communities that were connected up the entire coastline of Queensland, with the idea that you could listen to the changing soundscapes of Queensland's reefs, rivers, and rainforests in a way that's connected to local communities, but created this kind of cohesive listening experience up the entire coastline. And there were live streams as part of this as well, hydrophone live streams. And this kind of connected into the evolution of this work in a project called Listening Underwater, where I was interested in the idea of the GPS location of these sounds being quite responsive to environmental patterns and changes and the environment itself. So in this particular experience, which was created for Horizon Festival at Mooloolaba on the Sunshine Coast, the audience engaging with it actually had to take their shoes off and engage with the water. So walking along the coastline, and in the Orality app, what we were doing was updating the GPS location of the sounds every day with tidal data. So the sounds were basically moving based on the tides, so controlled based on the tides. So you had to, physically engage with the water to listen to the sounds. Take your shoes off, walk along the coastline and listen to these sounds beneath the surface. And this, allowed quite a dynamic way for the sound material to adapt and evolve every day during the festival. And we also had, a strip of sonic material along the boardwalk, which is wheelchair accessible, to ensure that the experience was, very inclusive for the whole community as well. And this, all of the sounds that were basically added into this augmented reality sound walks during the day were then mixed live in this Listening Underwater dome as part of the live performances for Horizon Festival. And during these performances, I also had live hydrophones off the coastline, which was streaming into the dome and mixing live this database of underwater soundscapes from across the planet, with a particular focus on Southeast Queensland. And this was extended in the context of the same festival, sort of looking at the next steps and experiments with this kind of work. I was quite fascinated by the way that, as much as these were audio-based listening experiences, the way that people were still quite engaged with their phones. Even when I was saying, download the app, the sounds will all play automatically. They're GPS triggered. As you walk into them, they will play. So you can just literally put your phone in your pocket or back in your bag and walk through these soundscapes and listen. But what I found quite fascinating is, participants in these sound walks and an audience would stay quite visually engaged in their phones, still looking at the screen. So I wanted to experiment with a way to create the same location-based audio experience, but essentially mix it live like a transient performance. So this was a series of sound walks where the audience is all wearing Bluetooth headphones. So they've basically got a network of headphones. We're walking through a series of locations, and I'm basically mixing the soundscapes live. We were really lucky to have Brent Miller, local traditional Gubbi Gubbi custodian, give us a welcome to country, but also play Didge into the water with the live hydrophones that I'm mixing live into these sound walks. So we end up with this really dynamic and rich soundscape that is revealing what's happening beneath the surface of the water and allowing the listeners to connect to the soundscapes that are beneath their feet as they're walking along the foreshore. And this was, quite a different listening experience for a lot of the audience. They kind of, the feedback was that it was a much more kind of embodied, deep listening experience in comparison to engaging directly with what was happening on their phones. They found the freedom of being able to walk anywhere and knowing that the sounds were being mixed live, very immersive and engaging, despite it being quite similar sonic material to what was planted in the app. So quite an interesting comparison of those experiences. And the final project I just wanted to mention sort of briefly towards the end of this presentation is a work called Listening in the Wild, which was created last year during COVID lockdowns. And this was initially developed or commissioned as transient listening experiences in 3 different environments on the Sunshine Coast. And due to the lockdowns, we basically developed these as live streams online where we mix those soundscapes of those particular locations live. And I was very privileged again to work with Lyndon Davis, Gubbi Gubbi traditional custodian, and documentary photographer Dr. Trisha King, who basically visually documented these sites for people to engage with before the live streams. So this was done across a series of locations which had a very strong aquatic focus, very relevant to Meeting of the Waters, where, in this instance, Lyndon playing Didge into the surface of the water, which was again kind of captured through these hydrophones, live streaming, and you could kind of hear the Didge really reverberating through the banks of the river system. And it was very much about engaging with these waterways in a sonic a sonic way, but then weaving this with Lyndon's narrative and Gubbi Gubbi stories. So Lyndon kind of told stories along the banks of the river, which kind of basically threaded these soundscapes together. And the whole kind of trilogy experience closed with a journey out to Old Woman Island, which is not far off the coastline here on the Sunshine Coast. And this was the first time that Lyndon had physically been to Old Woman Island. And it's a very significant Gubbi Gubbi site. So it was a very rough day. So we weren't able to actually get the boat onto the island. We had to anchor and swim across. And it was also in the middle of the migration season for humpback whales. And you can see Lyndon on the head of the island there. But this was the first time that Lyndon had listened to whales live through hydrophones. So part of this kind of live stream experience was us with the hydrophones in the water listening to these migrating humpback whales while we're listening to Lyndon tell the stories of this place, talking about listening to country, talking about listening to humpback whales as a Gubbi Gubbi totem species, and talking about really connecting with water in a sonic and embodied way. Now, if you would like to listen to some of those recordings rather than streaming them through the platform, you can have a listen on listeninginthewild.com. We've got documentation of those 3 different soundscapes connecting to different bodies of water, with Lyndon's stories and knowledge weaved through them, up on the Listening in the Wild site. And also a lot of Trisha's documentary photos of the experience are up there as well. And I just wanted to finish off by saying, for me, all of these experiences connecting to different places through sound is fundamentally about engaging, directly with the community and making sure that these experiences are as accessible and as engaging as possible for the next generation, as the generation that will experience the true ramifications of climate change. I'm incredibly passionate about ensuring that, both the science and the creative practice is creating pathways for young people to engage with this field and creating ways that ensure that young people can really take agency in these processes and projects as well. And, certainly when a young person is kind of engaging with listening, deep listening, and listening to hydrophones for the first time, it's always such a fascinating process to witness, to see how young people can connect to waterways through sound in a really embodied way. So I did just want to close by saying, for me, the kind of next steps of both this creative practice and research is really about shifting from, sound as a monitoring engagement tool to sound as a tool for regeneration, to look at how these locative audio experiences can really contribute towards regeneration efforts. We're engaged in a number of research projects at the moment in both terrestrial and aquatic environments, looking at the potential of sound playback in regeneration efforts. There's a lot of evidence that this works in a terrestrial kind of forestry regeneration context, and a lot of evidence that it works in aquatic environments with coral and seaweed. So I'm really engaged in that intersection of kind of shifting from passive to active and really looking at how acoustic ecology and these locative experiences can be directly engaged and really leading regeneration efforts. We're obviously engaged right now in the UN decade on ecosystem restoration. So, restoration, regeneration, and climate action more broadly is certainly at the core of all of this work. And the guy pictured there is Professor Nick Paul, who is one of my colleagues at the University of the Sunshine Coast, where I'm now based, who has been really pioneering work around seaweed regeneration and the potential of seaweed as a food source, but the potential of seaweed to solve so many problems that we've got in our environment today. So I guess, a lot of this work, as much as it's really responding to the crisis that we're in, I think there's so much incredible things that are happening in different parts of the planet. We're seeing, an uprising of Indigenous knowledge systems really being prioritized in climate action, which I think is so critical. And I know that's a core part of this event that you're all engaged in. And, despite the crisis and the anxiety of what's happening, I think there's so much positive work and research happening in this space as well. I think that is how I will close this presentation and say thank you very much. I'm super happy to answer any questions. I know the idea was to kind of speak for an hour and then move into some questions. I think Tracy's on her way back. Yes, she is.
Yeah, thank you so much, Leah. That was just phenomenal. I'm just always blown away by your projects and I was looking at the comments and thinking about the layers of the work and how it's sort of operating in such a diverse range of tenors, I guess is one word that came to mind. And I also love looking at the southeast Queensland because that's my homeland, is that part of the world. So always like to see something off the coast. I'm going to open straight up for questions. Fred will pop us over to the group mode. So Leah, you'll be able to see everybody because people can turn on their their mics and cameras.
Awesome.
And I'm sure that there's some questions or comments in the audience because everyone was very chatty. There's Ross. I really love that you ended the talk on a really positive note. Like, we are confronted with a lot of really huge issues, but I think that there's a lot of good work happening. And that sort of, I think, for me, gives me hope, that we might actually turn a corner on what's happening in the world. Did we lose Leah?
Hi. So can you talk a little bit about noise pollution in the ocean? Because I know that whales and dolphins and other marine animals communicate, but I also know that the level of noise in the ocean, because of these big ocean-going vessels and even other things, are contributing to their lack of being able to communicate. Do you know if anything is being done about this?
We have lost Leah for a few seconds, but now she's presenter again and she can reactivate her camera and mic. You can perhaps switch off your camera for the bandwidth.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened there. I full screened and then I disappeared, but I'm back. Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent.
Would you like to repeat your question, Geeta?
Yeah, I'll turn off my camera because my bandwidth is low. So Leah, I am the whales and the communication that whales have in the ocean. And I'm also aware that we have a lot of noise pollution in the ocean and it's increasing really rapidly. And this is something which concerns me because whales communicate from one ocean to another throughout the length of the ocean in order to get, companionship or mates or things. And this is affecting them. Do you know if anything is being done about that?
In terms of marine, I guess activism in the acoustic space in the ocean, yeah, look, there's a lot of scientific research happening around noise pollution and the impacts on particular species of marine mammals. It's certainly, I guess like that question around the visibility of and the audibility of noise pollution in a terrestrial environment, we simply wouldn't tolerate the level of noise pollution that happens in marine or freshwater environments in terrestrial environments because humans would be exposed to them and hearing them. So, certainly when we look at what's actually happening in some of those really significant examples of noise pollution, whether that be the impact of, large kind of shipping lanes or sonar that's being tested, oil and gas exploration, it would be like having, a nail gun or a chainsaw running in your 30 centimeters from your ear 24/7. So there's a significant amount of research from a scientific perspective and a kind of sonic activism perspective that's certainly happening in that space, but there's a lot more that's needed. And there's a number of scientists in different clusters around the planet. There's quite a lot of work happening in Australia at different universities, that have really kind of validated the fact that the impact of noise pollution on marine mammals is significant. I mean, there were studies that happened last year in the first phase of COVID lockdown, off the coast of America, where the stress levels were measured in various marine mammals during that first period of lockdown. And it was, reported that their stress had significantly reduced in direct correlation with the reduction of shipping noise in the ocean. Likewise, when shipping noise started to increase in parts of Europe, there was, direct correlation conservation, with more agitation in marine mammals in that part of the world. There was plenty of examples of whales, charging boats and things like that. So it's there's no question that the impact of noise pollution in marine environments is something that urgently needs to be addressed, and there is a lot of people, directly working towards that, but certainly more work is needed in that area.
Yeah, thank you. It's very sad, and I don't know what we can do about it.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I guess for me, it's also about those experiences of making more people aware, which is where I think, some of the creative experiences and that immersive and embodied engagement with sound underwater can kind of help communities understand what it is actually like to listen underwater, listen in this, space which is truly an acoustic environment. So I think, creative practice has incredible value in bringing a wider attention and awareness to that as well.
Yeah, I once made a sculpture where I took the sound of humpback whales and I connected it to SOS signals with LED lights. And it was a movement based work. So when you came in front of the work, the whale sound started, and at the same time the LED lights also started with the SOS signals. So I became, really aware of the marine animals and how they don't have a voice. And I think it's really important for us to give them a voice, because animals like the whales and the dolphins, I think they have so much to teach us, but we just don't know their languages yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you.
I have a very practical question, which is just if there's any decent training in Australia on field recording. I so want to do this. I'm really wanting to capture macro field sounds in the wild, and just those hydrophones that you were talking about. I haven't used those before.
Yeah, okay. I'd encourage you to connect with the Australian Wildlife Sound Recording Group, which is a national network that's got members in most states that do facilitate, outside of COVID, facilitate an annual recording trip and workshops and sharing of resources and materials and writing around field recording. There's also the Australian Forum for Acoustic Ecology, which, while doesn't necessarily host regular workshops, has a very wide network of practitioners who would be, I'm sure, really willing to kind of share advice and ideas, and quite an active group on social media as well. Ross is part of both of those groups. And yeah, there's regular workshops facilitated in the context of several universities. Where I'm based at USC, we're sort of in the process of getting up, pending kind of how COVID unfolds in the next few months, getting up a regular workshop program where we can offer field recording workshops in the local Biosphere Reserves as well.
Will they be online, Leah, or will they be locally available?
I mean, locally available, because it will be kind of focused on field work in the Biosphere Reserves, but we will certainly look at the potential of hosting some field recording workshops, short, courses online as well. That's sort of been a conversation, and through Biosphere Soundscapes, a lot of the field work, or in fact, all of the field work for Biosphere Soundscapes is on hold at the moment with travel restrictions, but we've been hosting smaller scale kind of conversations and things online, and so we'd be looking at opening it up to some broader field recording workshops online early next year. So I'd be really happy to share the information about those as well.
Brilliant. Thank you.
No problem.
Any other questions? Don't be shy.
Yeah, one question. What is your relation with images, and especially with spectrograms, which is a way to visualize the sound?
Yeah, great question. I had a whole section on spectrograms in the presentation that I was working on, but I took it all out because I thought otherwise that's going to be, another hour of material. But I mean, I guess for me, a lot of the performance and installation-based work is very much about engaging in an acousmatic sense, so engaging purely with the sound. But spectrograms have been a huge part of the research that I've been engaged with over the last few years from both a creative and a scientific perspective. When we talk about, I guess, those databases of sound, the large databases of sound, I've estimated that I could never listen to all of the river listening sounds I've recorded in my lifetime. It would just be physically impossible with the amount of data that is there. So this idea of looking at long durational spectrograms to really understand and comprehend large acoustic data sets allows us to sort of connect with these long durational sound recordings in new ways. So, hi, Arthur.
I can't see for the chat. It's too interesting.
Sorry. Yes, so that's it's a really important part of what I'm really interested in, and what, a lot of people in the ecoacoustics and acoustic ecology space have really been looking at in terms of understanding large data sets. So Michael Towsey, who's an incredible scientist based at QUT in Brisbane, has developed a technique called false color spectrograms, which is essentially allowing us to map particular parameters over a spectrogram. So it means when we have a spectrogram that might be, 48 hours long, we're able to then understand particular patterns and changes, or identify particular species or acoustic complexity through mapping colors over different questions we ask of the spectrogram. So there's so much exciting potential to be explored in that space as well. And I can pull up a couple of examples if you like, if others are interested as well. But yeah, I didn't kind of focus that on in this presentation, but it's certainly a big part of this work from both a creative and a scientific perspective.
Yeah, I just want to say I found the idea of a global sound map so wonderful. And it's a different way of looking at our world and giving us experience we never had before, or reminding us of experiences we had as a small child. Because I was brought up in Trinidad and Tobago, which has some kind of rainforest. So sometimes when I hear sounds from the rainforest, something else inside me activates itself, because it's a kind of learned experience, and you get so much from listening to the sounds of nature, of the birds or the whales. It speaks to another part of you. So I really found that was a really wonderful idea, because we are so used to looking at the world in a visual means, and we never think of listening to sounds. So I think it's really wonderful. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Leah. I have a question for you. Actually, two. I don't know if that's my audio kicking off again. First off, what's a short description of what a spectrogram actually is? And then secondly, I think I'm very interested in the space of engagement between an audience and people absorbing the work. And I just found it very interesting that the live experience kind of prompted a more present exchange with the participants. And I'm just wondering about, is there a need, or is there I guess a need to always consider the physical space and to make somebody a more actively engaged participant rather than an observer, so that it becomes more about that they actually feel like they're having some sort of engagement or impact on the scene as well, either energetically or otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, so your first question, spectrogram, essentially a visualization of sound. So a way that we can visualize a sound recording and, allowing us to actually understand what's happening across that spectrum of sound. So if we're talking about wanting to identify a particular, frequency band or a particular species, if we wanted to see an eagle calling in a recording, the spectrogram is a way to visualize that sound field, essentially. And yeah, I guess your second question, look, I think there's kind of, pros and cons to both. I was just quite fascinated by, I guess, the difference between programming an augmented reality experience or a locative audio experience in a festival where the audience can basically access it anytime. And obviously that's giving a lot of agency to the audience in how they engage, how fast they walk, where, the time of day that they're actually engaging with those sounds as well. And I was always quite fascinated by a lot of the festivals that were commissioning this kind of work to really look at a kind of temporal based event during these sound walks where, we would be timing the sound walk from, 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. on Friday of the festival, come and go on a guided sound walk where I was kind of guiding the audience through the experience. And the sort of shift in how people were engaging with it was quite different. And I'd always find that there would be, quite a bit of stress at the start of the experience, in that there'd always be a bunch of people that, couldn't download the app for whatever reasons, couldn't remember iTunes passwords, or something wasn't working. So there would be some people kind of really patiently waiting, others that were having trouble getting the experience working, which, is my fault clearly in terms of the actual app itself. But I was always, quite fascinated by, I guess, not necessarily starting an audience off in an experience where it was really, setting the tone for kind of deep listening. So I guess for me, I was interested in how I could sort of resolve that experience, but then also knowing that when we're in these kind of guided sound walks, like observing how people were engaging with their phone and, still engaging with responding to text messages or emails, well, not necessarily, but still engaging with that kind of physical, visual interface of the phone. So for me, that idea of kind of taking the phones away and having people immersed in that performative experience where, like you say, their kind of physical presence can be heard through the live mix. You can hear a person kind of walking along that riverbank, or we had contact mics and hydrophones in the tree, so you could touch the tree and kind of hear your physical response in real time. Was, very different in terms of that embodied engagement. And I think that is, removing the sort of the pressure or stress of using the tech of the kind of audience or participant using the technology in a collective listening experience, but then also the kind of real-time performative nature of it, I think, shifted that embodied listening as well. But obviously, the app-based experiences and that locative audio is still such a huge part of all of this work. And I think as an individual listening experience and as a kind of non-linear and experience where people can access at any time of day or night during events, festivals, conferences, whatever, it's, the ideal way for audiences to access that. But when we kind of shift it to a collective listening experience, I think that, making that technology as smooth as possible really, enhances the experience and contributes towards that potential for embodied and deep listening. Does that answer your questions?
Yeah, no, that's great, because it's like I play with performance in a visual sense, and I find, because I work with digital photography, and I find that when I allow myself to do this free flow thing, which has me more present, it's like the work is stronger. or it's more embodied. So it's like my experience is more embodied, hence the audience's experience is more embodied. And there's a performative aspect. And I think when you've got a live listening experience like that, it becomes a performance, and every person that's there is one of the actors within the performance. And I think that it's also about this blend between the digital and the real, like to always to try and find and strike a balance between the two, because it is actually crossing over into that space. It's like that liminal in-between space, and to have an aspect that is both physical and real life and an aspect that's both kind of purely immersed in the digital. I think there's a very important, like even on an energetic, the way the work is digested by an audience as well. I think it's a very fine balance to strike, to make it as an immersive and to have the most impact, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess it's I guess it's a kind of case by case in terms of the actual location and the audience and all, and the context of the performance as well. But yeah, absolutely.
Leah, I'm wondering if you might be able to share with me some of the links. I've written down a couple of them, but if you could email me some of the links. We've got a very large document called the Participants Information Sheet, and as we've gone along, I've just been adding resources because I think there's a few people who'd be really keen to follow up on some of those organisations and your projects as well.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that'd be great. Any more questions for Leah?
Yes, I have a question. Hi, Leah. This is Christine. I'm in the United States on the Great Lakes, on the unceded lands of the Potawatomi. And I'm sorry if this question is a little circuitous and meandering because I'm just putting it together as I'm speaking with you. But I'm curious about audience engagement and modalities of listening. So in looking at your work, what I'm understanding is that sometimes there's immersive listening experience that has to do with, listening to the sounds, various creatures underwater, let's say. And then another kind of listening experience where you've integrated with your collaborator, whose name, I'm sorry, I've forgotten, integrating story. And so those are two different kinds of, listening modalities. One is this kind of, reduced listening. The other one has to do with really listening to the story and being in this other space. So I was wondering if you could reflect on audience engagement, especially around climate action, or even just a general appreciation of the environment or the location that they're in, and the different modes that you employ to do that and which you feel are successful in that. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, those different, I guess, modalities of listening is a really important one when it comes to this kind of acoustic ecology work as well. And I think it's quite interesting in that sort of intersection of artistic and scientific practice as well, and the kind of subjective nature of sound and listening, and some of the tensions with the sound material. I mean, when we're looking at freshwater ecoacoustics, for example, underwater recordings of river systems, a lot of those sounds are quite abstract. So, to immerse a listener in a very abstract and raw recording, I mean, many of us might find that really rich and dynamic, but it's I guess a challenging mode of listening for many people who haven't been exposed to those soundscapes before. And what's also fascinating, I think, about some of the aquatic soundscapes, particularly in freshwater ecosystems, is when we're looking at it from a scientific perspective and sort of from a climate indicator or environmental indicator perspective, measuring environmental health through sound, many of the sounds that in particular river systems that could actually be an indicator of degradation, of kind of a degrading ecosystem, actually sound really rich and dynamic. So, and in comparison, sounds that might be quite kind of confronting and not that sonically interesting or engaging to listen to are actually indicators of environmental health. So we have this tension in that you can't necessarily, well, you can't map sonic complexity and sonic richness to environmental health, or the presence and absence of particular species or particular sounds to a healthy river system. So sort of in addition to playing with those different listening modalities, you've then got this tension around what the material actually means to the health of the environment and what it actually sounds like in terms of an engaging listening experience. And for me, you know, the embodied listening and engaging with those sounds is the priority, but fundamentally the work is about looking at how these sounds can reveal information about the health of these environments and, you know, engaging communities in understanding what these sounds actually mean. So there's that balance between ensuring that what those recordings actually are is really transparent, and how they're actually kind of treated in these installations or performances is really clear as well. But then also, you know, being quite transparent about my, I guess, creative license as a composer and sound artist in how those sonic worlds are sort of constructed into these embodied listening experiences. And, you know, for me, there's got to be elements of the experience that are really drawing listeners into that mode of kind of deep listening and being immersed in those sound worlds. It can't be, you know, a consistent kind of really confronting and raw soundscape. I mean, of course it can, but that's not, I guess, the approach that I take. It's very much about kind of gently drawing audiences into these worlds and then taking them on kind of journeys through these different ecosystems and looking at ways that we can really facilitate that idea of listening from a non-human perspective as well. I mean, the migration patterns work that I spoke about earlier, and a lot of the Biosphere Soundscapes work is sort of, you know, traversing through these ecosystems and listening to these recordings, you know, from very different perspectives, facilitating that listening from a non-human perspective, whether that's sort of, you know, listening to like micro or macro invertebrates in mangrove mud, where we're actually listening from the perspective of a very small insect, to comparing that to, you know, listening from the perspective of a marine mammal, where our skin is kind of sensing the sound. So, you know, playing with, I guess, the different modes of listening in a standard sense, but then also in looking at how we can sort of facilitate or inspire pathways into that kind of non-human listening as well.
That's really great. Thank you so much for talking about that. I love that idea of transposing the listening experience to the more than human animal. You know, so that's really, really fascinating to me. And then the other just part of the question was, when you do add a storytelling element or a narrative element, how does that change it for you, both as an artist, but how do you think it changes for the audience as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, for me as an artist, I guess working with Lyndon Davis, who I mentioned, you know, a couple of times in that presentation, who I've collaborated with a lot over the years, you know, living on Gubbi Gubbi country, I guess it kind of really grounds the work in what it's, you know, really about. And Lyndon talks about, you know, listening to country and sound as a way to really, you know, inspire people to connect at a deeper level, and, you know, that the stories of country are kind of embedded in those sounds. So it feels to me like a great privilege that I have permission from Lyndon as a collaborator to kind of weave his voice into these soundscapes. And, you know, he's very much a big part of that composition and collaborative process as well, of course, but it feels like it really grounds the work in, you know, in that intersection of listening to the environment, and the kind of intentions of Biosphere Reserves around the conservation of biological and cultural diversity. That biological and cultural diversity are, you know, inherently interconnected, and separating those is, you know, where so many of these problems started. So for me, it really grounds the work, but I guess that then becomes, you know, challenging in a in a purely scientific context where some of the recordings are sort of presented as installations as well. The presence of voices or the more compositional approach can be somewhat confronting for scientific collaborators in that there can be that perception that it sort of devalues the purity of the sound or the authenticity of the sound from a scientific perspective. So obviously there's ways that needs to be tread fairly lightly, but then also, confronted quite in quite a forward way in a lot of contexts as well. But then, from an audience perspective, I think it's often the narrative elements and the voices that can weave through these experiences that in the same way as I'm talking about it from the perspective as an artist, that can really ground the recordings in that place and time. If it's, we're listening to the humpback whales, or we're listening to the kind of crackling and popping of snapping shrimp, and Lyndon's talking about how, those particular shrimp are kind of, key species in that part of the river system and are kind of cleaning the gills of sharks that are there at that particular time of year in response to seasonal changes. That is kind of, grounding the sounds in that place and time, and giving the audience another kind of layer to connect to in terms of their immersion in those sounds and their connection to kind of what that world of sound actually is and means and kind of could be in terms of that particular ecosystem.
Thank you so much. That's just brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Leah, I have another one, if I might. It's in relation to installation of your work, and because by the looks of your work is awesome, by the way.
Thank you.
In relation to like showing your work, have you ever taken the sound from somewhere and actually put it within a gallery space that is soundproofed, or that's just somebody mentioned the whales earlier on and feeling through the skin, and I just imagined like speaker walls pulsing or something to give that sense of vibration. But I'm just wondering if you have ever taken your audio away from the actual source of the audio or outside of that space and shown it within more of that formal context, but also within a space where you can totally control the other external sounds within the space, and how that would affect or impact, or whatever your thoughts are on that. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been super lucky to, exhibit a lot of the sound works in different galleries. And I think it's always, quite fascinating how visual art spaces, might respond to or talk about sound, and just how sound sort of functions in a gallery setting as well. I've got a work which is part of the Biosphere Soundscapes project, which is installed as part of an exhibition, an art science exhibition called Sites of Connection on the Sunshine Coast at the moment in the USC Art Gallery. And this is a geodesic dome, a kind of 8-channel geodesic dome. So it's got 8 speakers inside the dome. And we've built acoustic paneling all inside the dome to kind of contain the sound. But the gallery is such a reverberant space that even with the sound down quite low, an 8-channel surround sound with acoustic panels all over the dome. The dome's basically built in the gallery. The sound is still filling the entire gallery space to the point that it is, you can hear it in the offices of the gallery staff down the hallway, because it's just such this rich acoustic reverberant environment. And all of the majority of the sound material is either underwater sounds or underground sounds. So it kind of works in this way that initially I think the curators were a bit concerned and conscious of the fact that the artwork had kind of spilled through the entire space, but now it kind of works as it really creates this layer over the exhibition, but then is kind of drawing people into the dome as well. And likewise, I've experimented with different ways to present more directional sound in a gallery, or also use transducers, so kind of bone conduction, where you're only activating that sound with with your kind of touch or your presence of sort of listening through your hands or playing the sound through your spine if you're leaning up against it, that kind of thing as well.
That sounds great. Thanks.
No worries. Pleasure.
I was very interested in some of the things you were talking about at the end of your talk about how you're starting to use sound now to help reconstruct environments. Because for me, that seemed to really open a doorway to another level of collaboration with traditional communities who often use sound in healing, and sound healing is embedded in a lot of traditional knowledge communities. And I wondered if you've done that, and if that then can be used to witness the impact. Can sound, you were talking about measurements of stress of marine animals changing when the rate of shipping changed. And I wondered if that was a sound-based measurements, and then can those measurements then start to witness and work in collaboration with those traditional methods like singing up the land that they do in Australia, and start to measure and witness those impacts? Because that would be really interesting.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's, like I was kind of saying in parts of the presentation, it's fascinating at the moment, just the rate of research that's happening in this space and the potential for sound as a tool for regeneration. Like you say, it does intersect beautifully with, many Indigenous healing practices around sound and the idea of that kind of interconnected nature of sound in the environment, and looking at how, sound can completely transform an environment and how different species from, plants to insects really respond to sound as well. I did some work through my PhD many years ago now with a Brahmin community in South India around the Atiyatharam ritual, which is essentially a 10-day sound ritual where Brahmin chants are essentially directly responding to environmental health and healing the environment and changing the rate of growth in particular species. And, at this point in time, we were working with some scientists at Cochin University in India who were measuring the rate of growth based on sound with different species of plants. And I guess that research, very much informs a lot of these different perspectives we're looking at the moment around regeneration, which, part of this is looking at, again, working with Monica Gagliano, who I mentioned earlier, is looking at maternal soundscapes of particular plants. So this idea that if we're going to regenerate a forest, for example, or regenerate a particular area, as an example, we might be basing that regeneration effort on a 60% or even a 40% success rate of the survival of those plants. So if we're taking seedlings from a lab and, shifting them to a environment that they're basically shocked and, there's only a percentage of them that would be surviving. Whereas we've been looking at different methods of basically sonic transitions where you're taking the sound from that environment where they've been seeded and transferring that into the environment where they're being planted. And likewise, this is very early research and, not published yet, so I would encourage you not to share it too far and wide, but likewise similar research that's happening in tropical reef ecosystems and in different marine environments as well, with seaweed, as I mentioned, around sound as a tool for regeneration. And we've already seen multiple examples of how this can work in a really positive way on the Great Barrier Reef, where not even as a tool for regeneration, but actually taking the sounds of a healthy reef and installing speakers and playing back those soundscapes of a healthy reef at the site of a dead reef or the site of a reef that's been impacted by ocean acidification. And because different marine species, fish in particular, but a whole variety of species are basically navigating their way to the reef through sound, they navigate to that dead reef and are essentially beginning that restoration and regeneration process, which is triggered through sound. So another example, I guess, of that active engagement with sound, but certainly the intersections of, Indigenous practices around sound as a tool for healing and sound as an embodied tool in the environment, for actually healing different ecosystems, and the intersection of the kind of scientific possibilities of regeneration is, incredibly exciting in terms of its potential.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's such an interesting area. Thanks for alerting us to it.
Pleasure.
Leah, can I read some of the comments in the chat? Because you probably
Sure.
haven't had a chance.
No, I haven't looked at the chat at all. Sorry. Oh, there it is. I can see it now. Yes.
Yeah, I'll just read a few because they're really great. So Simone said, I want to put an audio moth in my grandma's backyard and see what birds come to her backyard. Would also like to listen to rivers in the desert with a hydrophone. I like how you talk about accessibility, Leah. And I'll just scroll down. And this one from Sue. It would be cool to isolate each sound and then layer them to reconstruct the ecosystem in an installation in a sound room with images, and then have each sound happen in isolation and then layer them together like what they would be in nature. I would never leave that room. That's beautiful. Now, do we have any last questions before we let Leah escape and go and have a dinner, probably? It's that sort of time of the session, isn't it? Right on dinner time. One more question or a comment?
Just really quickly, when you were talking about sound regeneration, is it frequencies that the plants are responding to?
Yes.
or is it rhythms, or what is it? I'm curious.
So particular frequency bands, yes. Yeah, so not specifically rhythms. It's looking at particular frequency bands. But as I said, it is, really early stages of the research. And in the context of seaweed, we know that seaweed can kind of be shocked into rapid growth, and that shock can happen from either like a rapid temperature change or a rapid sound. So there's testing that we're sort of now doing around how a frequency can be used to sort of shock seaweed and trigger that rapid growth and regeneration process. But of course, there's, a whole range of ethical considerations that then come into play when we start using sound in that way underwater as well. But I guess, the fundamental thing is that, the power of sound and how it impacts so many different species beyond, our perception is quite profound. And I think we'll continue seeing a huge influx in ecoacoustics research across the next decade.
Yeah, thank you. So vibrations. Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, definitely. I mean, there's some really interesting comments now saying about frequency and vibration that Tesla quote, it's moving too fast, about understanding the universe, and frequency is energy like sun and oxygen. Yeah, I really love that whole idea about the vibrational quality of things, because it's felt too. It's not heard sometimes. It's actually just like you were talking about, leaning up with your spine against, a part of the gallery and feeling that reverberation of the sound come through.
Mm-hmm.
It's that very deep embodiment. And and Sarah Jane Pell's back with us. We lost you for a bit there, Sarah. Terrific presentation and eloquence. Thanks, Leah. I'll actually get you all of the chat if you like, and of all the compliments that you're getting through the
Thank you.
the chat. Okay. Anyone